In this lesson here, we're going to be looking at the relationship between the circumference and pi, and also how to calculate the circumference. So a couple of key learning goals here is that you understand, well, hopefully you understand what pi means and its symbol and how we approximate that, but also how to use the formula to calculate the circumference, and you're going to be able to do those things. So before we get to that, there's a couple of key parts that we need to know, which is the features of a circle. And the first thing is how to define a circle. And it's kind of, we all know what a circle is really, but how do you actually define it? We usually say, oh, it's just something round, etc. But the reality is for a circle is, and I'll get you to write this down, is that it's a set of all points in a plane that are the same distance from the center point. So if we, and effectively this is how circles are created, it is the same length from the center point. If we just put multiple dots around there and we just kept doing that, we'd actually create a circle, because no matter what point we get to, it's the same distance from the center. And that's the definition of a circle. Now within that, there's a couple of key things that we need to make sure we know. The first is the radius, and you can copy this drawing down, might be a good example. And then we're going to use these three things that we need to know. The first part is the radius. Now the radius here is the point from the distance from the center to the circle, okay? So from the center point of the circle to the circle, we call that the radius. The diameter, on the other hand, goes from one point of the circle to the other, and it goes through the center. So the line segment, which represents the distance across the center of the circle, and that is what we call the diameter. Now the diameter, if you're aware, is twice the length of the radius, okay? So two radiuses create a diameter, and that's important to know later on once we get to calculating circumference. Now what is circumference? It is basically the circle, or the perimeter of the circle. But the circumference is the distance around a circle, or the length of the edge of the circle. So basically it's the perimeter of a circle. Now what that leads to, an important feature that we do need to know moving forward, is what pi is. Now we've looked previously at how pi came about, etc. And for just a quick recap, basically pi, there was a relationship between the circumference and the diameter. And that relationship was that obviously it's hard to bend that or to measure a circumference. But basically we've put 3 diameters around and we get 0.14. So the circumference, no matter how big or small the circle, is actually 3.14 approximately diameters. And we're going to understand that relationship quite soon. But basically pi is the constant relationship between the diameter and the circumference of a circle. And we use this symbol here to represent pi. So sort of drew that, okay, it sort of looks something like that. Now the reason that we draw that is because the pi is an irrational number. So by that I mean it never repeats and it never ends. So pi in this instance, okay, we go on forever, but it's 3.14159, and that's correct to 5 decimal places. The reality though is that pi continues on forever and it never repeats, and we call that an irrational number. So we can try and approximate that by using 3.14, which is what we mostly use, or even as a fraction, which is 22/7. But because they're not accurate, we usually just use the symbol pi, which we've got here, and we use that to calculate our circumference, etc. And we use that either through the internet or by a calculator. So that's important to understand. So with that in mind, this is how we actually calculate the circumference of a circle. And there's 2 formulas. They're basically the same thing, but it's important that you understand the similarities. To calculate the circumference of a circle, C stands for circumference, it is 2 times pi times r. Now that means, continuing on, sorry, it also means pi times diameter. So as we've said before, the diameter is 2 radiuses or radii, okay? So it's 2. That's why we have 2 times radius times pi, or if you know the diameter, you can just go pi times diameter. So if you write those 2 down, we can actually work that out. Now again, the key thing here is that for an accurate response, you want to be using the actual button pi in either a calculator or the internet. Otherwise, just use the approximation 3.14. But let's have a look at it. Let's apply this now and put this into perspective. And we want to find the circumference of these two circles, and we're going to do it to 2 decimal places. So as I'm looking here, I can see that I have a radius. So I'm going to use the formula circumference equals 2 times pi times r, because I have a radius. So if I wrote that out now, I'd go 2 times pi times the radius, which is 3.5, and then I'm going to calculate that. So if I get my calculator, okay, I should put that in here, okay, and I have, you can see the pi symbol here. So let me just move that a bit out of the way, sorry. All right, so if I go 2 times pi times 3.5, that will give me the answer of 21.991, etc. recurring. We want to round that to 2 decimal places. So my answer here will be 21.999. Let me draw that better. And again, I always want to make sure I'm using the correct measurements, which is meters. So the circumference of that circle is 21.99 meters. Now if I'll scroll down further, we're going to do the second one. And as you can see, it has the diameter there. So I'm going to go use a formula. Circumference equals pi times diameter. So therefore it is pi times 4. And if I put that in the calculator now, we have a simple response of pi times 4 gives us the answer 12.566. We're going to round that to 2 decimal places, so I'm going to round it to 12.57 because I'm going to round that up, and it is centimeters. Okay, so that's why we should use the calculator, particularly for our circumference when using pi. If not, as I said, just use 3.14, but that's how we calculate again the circumference of a circle. So it is C equals pi d, or 2 pi times radius. So again, if you have any questions or unsure about anything, please make sure you write those notes down or those questions, and we can deal with that in class in a little bit more detail. Thanks, guys.